Okay. Okay, can you let people in? Thank you. Hello, comrades. Good evening to our Have Your Say show, which deals with some issues that arose since our last program, which was 2 weeks ago. And also, we would want to give comrades a chance to speak and make comments on anything you find interesting in the session now or in the session 2 weeks ago. We've also got Alan Simpson joining us again, former Labour MP. But before we get to him, we thought we discuss a few issues that have happened in the last 2 weeks since our last show. It's just been announced that the price cap, energy price cap, is going up to £3,608 a year on October the 1st, and then probably to something like £7,000 next year, which translates to, from October the 1st, the average will be like £10 a day for the average person. Loads of people paying more already. If you have kids, if you're disabled, if you're a carer and you have to have the heating on, etc., you'll be paying a lot more already. Inflation is set to rise to 13%. And we want to look a little bit at what Liz Truss is proposing to do. She's saying 10% cut in VAT might be one way to go, and she's very radical with that. She says, considering that most food is not actually doesn't have any VAT on it. It is quite questionable if that will make a big change. Interest rates have gone up to 1.75% and are bound to go up a lot more, which is likely to result in a lot of people not being able to pay their mortgages, house repossessions, etc. And it does look very much like we are going towards a recession. Jackie, we had a quick chat about this yesterday, and there are polls that say that up to 25% of people say they won't be able to use their heating at all. And you actually have some experience of what that means, don't you?
Well, what really annoyed me was all these discussions about just put a jumper on, put a scarf on, put your socks on, all of that stuff. We can be cold, because all that, we've got to be give some sacrifices because of the war in Ukraine. And what I was dredging up was not really dredging up, because it's such a distinct memory for me as a child. We were so poor that we actually stole coal from the coal yard next door to us. Our little kiddie hands could get underneath the gate. And the actual tragedy of that situation was my mother, who was actually very ill at the time. We didn't have central heating, so we were cold, which made her asthma really bad. But then even putting the coal fire on actually was killing her. And she actually died next to the coal fire. And when we're asking people to either put their socks on or use alternatives, what we're actually telling people who are poor or disabled is die, be sick. That's what we're telling the old and the sick. And I think that's an outrageous message to tell people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even more worrying. I think some economists believe that putting up interest rates in a period like this, which will lead to more unemployment, etc., is actually an effort to get unemployment up, because we're having at the moment what's called quite a tight labor market. Lots of people left because of Brexit. They had to leave the country, and there's very little unemployment at the moment, which means workers have a really good chance of getting above inflation pay rises, which of course they need, in order to survive at your current level, etc. So, forcing upon us unemployment as a way to save the economy seems a really horrific thing to comprehend. Do you agree with that assessment, Graham, that it's a concerted effort to, get more people into unemployment so you can, get them to accept worse wage offers?
Well, whether it's intentional, this is what's going to happen. We're in a full-scale crisis, and I think we would do well not to underestimate it. I think that facing, as we are now, the probability of Truss becoming the next Prime Minister, if she sticks to some of the stuff she's been coming out with in the last couple of days, then it's all hell will be let loose. I've been on these picket lines, CWU, RMT, and the scale of resistance is growing. It's not just now the summer of discontent, it could well be the autumn of discontent. And the development of enough is enough. And what's, of course, is totally missing from this is any Labour opposition at all. And so we got the contradiction between the fact that if Truss wins this, I think that's a major own goal for the Tories, and the probability, not certainty, probability of a Starmer-led government on the one hand, and the total absence of anything that he has to offer or say. And I think that will pose, in that period, the question of the relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions.
Can I ask you about your view on Enough is Enough, which, like we've all signed up to it, over 400,000 people have signed up to it. There are, though, and I'm hearing this quite a lot, where local rallies are planned, etc. It seems that it is sort of done without the left on purpose and trying to be respectable. Andy Burnham has joined it, and people like more left-wing Labour leaders, union leaders, have been de-invited or not allowed to speak, etc. I personally find that a very difficult strategy to comprehend, appealing to sections in the middle when clearly some radical solutions are now needed.
Well, I think at this stage, I'm going to hold back criticism, frankly. I don't see a problem if Andy Burnham wants to join up with Enough is Enough. So be it, good. I'm against excluding others, of course. But I think what's significant is that the trade unions are beginning to fill the vacuum left by the absence of anything from the Labour Party. And I think the words of Mick Lynch, I keep repeating them, but they've got to be repeated. But he says that we're going to plant the banner of trade unionism in our communities, not the Labour Party, the trade unions. And through the pressure we're going to build, we can put pressure on the Labour Party. And reading between the lines, what he's actually saying, and if the Labour Party is not up to it, then we're going to be at the next stage. So I'm all for critical support, but at this point in time, I think that the emphasis has got to be on support and building. And of course we make criticisms, but I don't think that's where we're at the moment.
And perhaps we can shift things still as they are being developed, as they tend to be fluid, etc. One thing I wanted to mention before we open up and bring in Alan is this, which I think is quite important as part of Boris Johnson's legacy drive that he's apparently undertaking now in the next few weeks, days and weeks. We must endure the full bill pain to defeat Putin. If we're cold, we'll defeat him.
That's outrageous, isn't it? Because actually the people who are going to feel pain are not his class.
Absolutely.
And to be truthful, it's not even people like me. I'm really lucky now. I wasn't when I was younger. I'm really lucky now. I can actually afford. I'll do without some other things, but I can afford to pay it. What they're talking about is asking the people who can afford the least to pay for what's going on in Ukraine, or to pay for anything at a time when, as we know, the rich have got richer. I mean, this is so outrageous. It makes my blood boil. And I don't understand how MPs are sitting there silently listening to this, or relatively silently. It's an outrage asking poor people to pay for yet another bit of disaster capitalism.
Yeah. It's also not quite true, isn't it? It's got to do with the war in Ukraine, but it's not all
Yeah.
there is. It
In
started
fact,
before.
in fact, the head of Octopus a couple of days ago, when he was asked this, and they've got this late night economy show, and he said, actually, if we all remember, we all knew in the energy business that this was coming. It wasn't about this. It started with COVID. It started with COVID. So this is not just about what's happening in Ukraine. But of course, they want it to do that. They want nationalism. They want all that patriotism stuff to cover up the failings of actually what's going on.
Yeah, and I think Tony in the chat here makes a good point, and this is absolutely spot on. Are they conditioning us for war?
Yes.
Which it is, of course, about the prices, but there is something else going on, isn't it? And I think we should remember a few weeks into the war, we were very close to an end to it. There was talks of Zelensky and Putin's second in command meeting up and getting very close to signing agreements, and agreements on Crimea and the Donbas region, etc. And suddenly that was taken off the table, and somebody somewhere was encouraged to carry on, and it was Western governments who carried on pushing to continue the war. And in my view, and there's differences of opinion, which I think we should discuss in this session, this is a proxy war. There is something bigger brewing, and it is the confrontation between US imperialism, which is going down the pan and experiencing incredible problems, and the rise of China and Russia, and China in particular, on the other hand. And this is a proxy situation that's been created and kept alive in order to, prepare us for something bigger. I think, Graham, you disagree with that assessment, do you?
No, I think it's a war on two levels. It's a proxy war between the imperialisms, but it's also a war of resistance by the Ukrainian people who have been invaded. And I don't think, what are they to do if their homes, their schools, their hospitals are being destroyed by the reactionary leadership of the Russian state? Of course, they've got to resist. But it's also what you say, and I think we need a much more nuanced response.
Yeah, Jackie, what do you think? Is this World War III in the making?
Well, I think it's a preparation for what I would say is for another kind of Cold War situation that's going to happen, not just with Russia, but with China as well. And as some of our listeners will know, I've been looking at this China situation for some time, partly because I know the country quite well. And actually, Russia is not going to be the chief competitors here, either for energy. I mean, very interestingly, again, on this same program, what they were talking about is that China is streets ahead of everybody on renewables as well. And it's China that's going to be the problem for the US, not Russia.
I think so too. We would want to bring in Alan Simpson now, former Labour Party MP, and we've had a really good discussion with you in our show 2 weeks ago, and a few things have come up since. There's two major things we wanted to bring up with you. First is Boris Johnson's promise, or what he wants to see through to become energy independent, is build a new nuclear power station every year. That's what he's hoping his legacy will be. Now, I remember going on the streets with my parents when I was young, demonstrating against nuclear power stations because they're not exactly safe, are they? But a lot of politicians are now going that way again, but there are other much better possibilities. Or do you think, nuclear energy, Alan, is a way to go? Can it be made safe?
No, I don't think it can, and it can't be delivered in time, and it can't be delivered within a meaningful budget. And all it does is attempt to prop up the past. So we just have to move the goalposts. I mean, nuclear, we're still waiting for the last commissioned nuclear power station to be completed. It has guarantees about price, the contracts for difference, which would come in now at over £108 a kilowatt hour. And that, I just think this is, megawatt, and this is just crazy. when renewables are coming in at 1/10 or 1/20 of that cost. And the issue that is being fought out behind the scenes is the notion of a deeply centralized, corporately controlled energy system that is massively opposed to a decentralized, renewable, sustainable, and integrated energy system. And that's the battle that I think the left has to fight. So that, in a sense, each of the specific issues for me requires a completely different economics and a completely different politics. And that's why I was saying in the last session that in a sense, instead of the left looking at who we have to pick fights with amongst ourselves, we need to take a big step backwards and fundamentally rethink the nature of survival politics in what is going to be a really turbulent century. And that means a fundamental rewrite of Marxism. It means we have to.
The second issue we wanted to speak to you about it. Somebody in the chat thought, and when we were discussing it amongst ourselves, actually thought, what does he mean by fundamental rewriting? Tear it all up and say, working class politics don't really matter anymore. It's very common. I'm not saying you're doing it, but we were told, Jackie and I were told at a festival last week that we shouldn't talk about working class. You shouldn't talk about left and right. You should just talk about people and stuff. Whereas I think there's lots of concepts in Marxism that are very useful for us to understand what is happening and why, who is producing and owning the means of production, those kind of things.
Well, the reason I would say I think we need this fundamental rethink is that for me, that would start from a shift from the politics of production to the politics of distribution and consumption. And overlaying the entirety of this is if we want to survive, it'll require an economics that lives within an annually contracting carbon budget. John MacDonald was really clear about this when I was doing that work for him in the Shadow Treasury, that climate physics is in the driving seat and politics has to rewrite itself around the realities of the turbulence that comes now. It is as part of everything we've neglected to do over the last 20 years. So that's where I think we can get an understanding of a different politics of inclusion that begin from circularity and distribution rather than production and growth and the expansion of global trade. And the danger for the left is that we've retreated behind the same presumptions that still drive the Conservative Party and sadly drive the current Labour leadership, the belief that somehow growth will just get us all out of the current economic crisis rather than race us even faster into it. So that's my starting point. I think we can live better and we can live more inclusively, but it has to be within a contracting carbon budget. And the left has to educate itself to give meaning to those terms. And in a sense, do I use working class, middle class, upper class? I don't know. I think it's poor or not poor is an easier distinction. Included or not included. But it seems who pays are now the corporately rich as much as the individually rich. And in some ways, we're having to rewrite our politics around the realities that we live in an age now of corporate feudalism, that the rules have been so dismantled as to allow a pillaging process to take place by a very small, often non-nationally based set of global corporate elites. at the cost to everyone else. And the solidarities that we can bring are about reclaiming the ownership, the common ownership of our collective ecological resources.
Can I pick you up on this though, when you're talking about the rewriting Marxism? And Marx's big breakthrough was an understanding that it's about who owns and controls the means of production, and that it's not the working class. The working class has to sell its labor power to those who own the means of production, and that distribution, pre-Marxists have made a big thing about, it's about the distribution of what is produced and how it's distributed, whereas Marx says no, it's who controls, and who decides what is produced and how it's produced. And that kind of, I think with the economic crisis, this still goes to the heart of what we're dealing with. Capitalism needs to constantly expand, as you said, and make a profit. And so it produces in the most irrational ways, short-termism. It doesn't think about, what people need. It thinks about what it can sell and make a profit with. Isn't that still valid today, that we need to pick on that point rather than the distribution of what is produced?
It's not an either or. Yes, it's important that we hold on to that, but also that we engage with the politics that runs with it. What is ownership of the means of production? I mean, I think we need to look at the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. And that triumvirate really cannot and should not be separated out, but they all have to fit within a duty to if we want to survive, we're going to have define the meaning of those in terms that will deliver an annual cut in our carbon emissions of around 10% a year. So the mode of production, as well as the ownership of production, has to change. Let me just give you some examples of that. In all the debates about energy, we've got this bizarre notion. Energy prices are going through the roof now, largely driven by this catastrophic increase in gas prices. That is true. But electricity prices are tied to gas prices for no other reason than the market rules that were set is that the market price is based on the cost of the last marginal unit of production, which is gas, which is bloody expensive. We could now be supplying electricity at renewable rates that actually collapse the price of electricity. And if we were to do what they are already doing in Denmark and in Germany, and you enshrine in the law what is called the right of local supply, it means that the plan is to put solar on every roof, with a south or west facing roof. You put them on schools, health centres, nurseries, everything. And you allow those localities to sell to themselves at what amounts to much closer to wholesale prices than retail prices. I took some of the MPs to look at what this meant in Germany a few years ago now. But the contrast was in a village called Feldheim, just outside Berlin. They have a community-owned energy company which produces more energy than they consume. And they sell it to themselves. They were selling it to themselves at 13 euro cents per kilowatt hour. In Berlin, 20 kilometers away, the market price was 27 euro cents a kilowatt hour. When we were knocking on people's doors in Feldheim asking what they felt about this, they were saying, well, we've got to do our bit for the planet. We've all got to carry our share of the responsibility for making this shift. We were the ones who said, and does the price make a difference? And they all laughed at that point. And they said, of course it does. What even the doubters in Feldheim have signed up to supporting this because it cuts their electricity bills in half. And that is already being done. In Denmark, after the 73 oil crisis, they passed a law that said energy is not a market, it's a service. By law, you cannot sell energy for a profit. You can sell it for the cost of production, the maintenance of system, and the expansion of system. And also, you have to do it on a combined heat and power basis. And so we were again going around the villages there and asking people what they thought about it and how they were affected by price increases. And they laughed at us and were scratching their heads because they couldn't remember when they had last had a price increase. Now this just, the MPs who were with us at that time all stood there with their mouths hanging open. They couldn't conceive of a situation where you didn't have energy price increases. But we do, because the market is rigged in favor of corporates. And the stuff that Jeremy wanted to do would have taken us in a completely different direction. But even for Jeremy, his team still were obsessed with the tight centralized control of the whole system. And the key on this is you move towards models of decentralized production, storage, and distribution. Why? Because you have a new democratic mandate for the common ownership of the means of energy production. Yeah. And in doing so, you can deliver annual carbon reductions because you're not shipping it all around the bloody country.
I mean, this kind of depends
the forefront of the practicalities rather than just the sloganizing of doing things radically differently.
Because this kind of depends on, you know, a government which allows you to do stuff like that. And I understand that the British government, for example, doesn't, and other countries don't allow that kind of decentralized.
Why aren't the left? Why isn't the left making this the platform that we occupy? And you know, the current government is crap, and we all know that. We wouldn't be in this Zoom meeting if we thought they were any good. But nor are we any good. And in that shift to a radical rethink of how we're going to live to get through this century, we're still off the case and off the pace. And we can pinch examples in almost every one of the key vulnerable sectors. If you take food, you know, the climate is, you know, as well as the war in Ukraine, is wreaking havoc with global food supplies. And we're going to have to relocalize food production and distribution. Now, some of the really interesting examples here. In Liège, their municipal authority has set up a thing called the Food Land Bank, and the local authority is supporting the formation of, I think, just over 100 farmers cooperatives, to supply 50% of the food needs for the whole region from within the region. And it's based on the commonality of ownership and engagement in that food production and distribution process, and cutting back food miles, the carbon footprint of food miles, by something like 90%. So you suddenly have a new fusion of democracy and carbon accountability in ways which, for me, are part of the redefining of Marxism in the context of a climate emergency which threatens to annihilate us all.
And this will go, of course, against the interests of big companies who have no interest in, you know, localized food production, decentralized.
Absolutely.
And I think that still gets us into the conflict with, you know, who owns those means of production, who makes the decisions, how things are produced, etc. But thank you very much for explaining your view on that. There's certainly radical rethinking.
Can I just say if you look at Denmark, you have to ask, if they did this in 1973, and the entirety of their energy system now is based on public, not just public ownership, but municipalized or localized ownership. And the three major cities are municipal owned energy companies, and all the rest are clusters of cooperatives. If they've been doing it successfully since 73, why isn't the left here even part of that debate? And we're just not. I think we've retreated behind slogans of our own that have left us politically and ecologically adrift from the really great crises of our time.
Thank you, Alan. We want to open it really up to comrades from the floor now. So if you have a question, want to make a contribution, try and keep it brief and say who you are addressing your question or comment to. You don't have to ask a question, you can just make a contribution. Comrade Marion, please.
Yeah, I think it's been a very useful discussion so far, but I think some of you are not aware of the scale of poverty in this country. Today on BBC, the programme after the night breakfast, they raised again the question that there's children going to bed at night, not even having a bed to sleep on. My next door neighbour, a lot of the time, she's got no gas or electricity because she's got no money. This is the scale of it, and redistribution is key. But before we can get to where we can really solve these problems, we have to understand the nature of the system and the period that we're actually in. And I think in some ways it's a very exciting period because Mick Lynch and other trade union leaders realise they've got to do something different. The same old crap ain't going to work. So we have to organise, and we have to be, I'm quite happy for Andy Burnham to get involved. And as Anthony said, we have to place demands on them. Yeah. And I think that is key. The problem with a lot of the left here, they forget how you actually build a movement. And sometimes you have to pose demands on people, and you have to hold our leaders to account for what they do and don't do. But for me, the key is you have to understand we have to go after Johnson and those that say it's for us to pay the price for this war. And all that support arming Ukraine and the arms industry have to think, because they are pawns in the game. Our main demand should be the end of the arms industry, no nuclear weapons. The money that's being wasted on these things could solve a lot of the issues that people have in this country. So we have to look at what we're saying. And I agree with Alan. One of the weaknesses of the left for many years is the fact that it hasn't done a lot of proper community work. The far right would not have got a hold in a lot of these communities, and Brexit might not have happened if the left had done what it should have been doing and the trade unions had been doing what it should have done in the communities. And it's about winning hearts and minds to say this system is corrupt, and if we work together and unite together, we can change it. We can take on the world and change it. Even one of my sisters, who's not exactly a revolutionary or even a Labour Party supporter, is saying she thinks we need a general strike, because people are beginning to realise the scale of what is confronting them. And a lot of my friends and neighbours are really scared at the moment. They're struggling now. Some days they're without gas and electricity. Let's not forget that. So we have to think, what are we going to do, and how are we going to build a movement? And the key thing is there's a war drive going on at the moment in America and in the EU, and they want the existing balance of forces to exist, if not totally destroy Russia and China, so that America is the main person. And we must not forget that. Whatever your opinion on Putin or the regime, let's look at what's going on and who is instigating the war in Ukraine and is attacking China to this day and surrounding China. Let's not forget. Now, our key task is to tackle our own ruling class in this country and stop the war drive and say, no, we don't want money spent on war. We want money so that children don't have to sleep on the floor. Okay. And there's I will wind up now, but this is the key. We have to look at what we can do and how we can build a movement that can be successful. So I'll leave it there. But the key thing is we should be also looking at how we work to get local democracy. And I think part of that's what Alan's talking about, having local control, deciding what we want in our communities and how we're going to go about getting it.
I know it's exactly that. It's locally and nationally and internationally. Yeah. We have to combine those two. Thanks, Marion. Steve.
Yes. Well, it's hard to follow Marion's very passionate contribution and very right contribution. Obviously, she's linking the energy crisis that Alan was talking about with the social crisis and with the crisis of poverty. So I really want to go back to what Alan was saying. I think that's where we have a problem. England has no democracy. It has no democratic and accountable system of government. And in one sense, and this is where this talk about centralization and decentralization, what is the balance of them? Well, what we do need is a centralized democracy with one parliament, with one law for the whole country, with a parliament elected by proportional representation, with our representatives elected, accountable, subject to recall and paid the average wage. And in that framework of law for the whole country, then you can decentralize everything within that plan so that local workers in local production factories and facilities can exercise control in their local areas. Local councils, regional councils can exercise a framework of democratic control, because without that, if we just simply go to decentralization on its own, then you're heading in a sort of anarchistic direction. So you have to have the centralization of law and policy in order to have a decentralization of control. And I think that what we have to do is we have to address the absence of democracy in England, the lack of a democratic infrastructure, the lack of having the knowledge and the information, so there's any kind of informed debate going on at all. So I think that's where the left has to do. We need the democratic institutions so that what Alan is talking about can become a reality, because without that, we don't have the means of carrying out those policies. So I think it's the absence of democracy is what is needed to make the kind of policies that Alan is talking about, turn them into something practical. Otherwise, we're just shouting powerlessly at a disaster that's growing up under our feet. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. Tony.
Yeah, I mean, my only reply to Steve would be to say that democracy isn't given, democracy is taken. And there's a crucial difference between it. Our rulers don't actually hand us democratic rights. I agree entirely with Marion. Just let me say, if you don't use one of your limbs, it can atrophy and waste away. And the left, in a sense, for the last 30 years, hasn't been using its critical faculties. It is now, I think, unable to realize the situation we're in. I think we are approaching quite a critical situation in many ways. And you only need to look at the Tory party, the leadership, at the very time when people are suffering, and they will suffer. What are they doing? They're having a debate about tax rises, about how best to cut taxes for those who have the least problems of all, for their rich buddies. And that says something. It reminds me of Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, totally out of touch with reality. But the left also has to get in touch with that reality. I was looking for figures of estimated price cap rises for my blog, which I wrote yesterday. And they're talking of £6,000 to £7,000 for next April. That's 6 months after the October rise. So that's double. People will simply not be able to afford that. And so when people have debates about can't pay, won't pay, or don't pay, it's irrelevant. People will not be able to pay regardless. The question is how we fuse that into a mass movement. And my worry about Enough Enough is it's simply going through the motions, nothing more. It's holding a series of rallies. Great. Well, the left does lots of rallies. John McDonnell does nothing but speak at rallies, but whenever Starmer confronts him with something, he backs down. And therefore, I'm really not impressed. The question is, what enough is going to actually do? How it's going to take the movement onto the streets to defy the government. And there's a number of things we have to do and to challenge. The first is that you can't break the law, because that's something that's sacrosanct. You can't, for instance, disable prepayment meters. Well, I think we have to say, if it's a question of breaking the law or breaking people, literally dying, then we break the law, that the law is not sacrosanct. It never has been, because it's an instrument of class justice. So we need to start almost revolutionizing how we think and how we approach these problems. And as for Ukraine, I mean, with all respect to my dear comrade Graham Bash, I do not accept that it is an imperialist war. This is not the First World War. It's not even the Second World War. It is a world hegemon, the United States, building its empire and asserting its control, and therefore seeking to marginalize, or worse, the Russia and then China. It's on the warpath. Russia is fighting, for better or for worse, a defensive war. We may not agree with it. I think Putin has been disastrous in what he's done, in the way that he's fallen into Biden's trap. But nonetheless, the reality is quite clear. NATO wants to dominate the whole of Europe and break up Russia as part of its goal of surrounding China and doing very much the same there. And to simply say what's an anti-imperialist war is really a cop-out, in my opinion. Thank you.
Lots of food for thought there, as always. Thank you, Tony. I think we have a round of summing up at the end, perhaps, because I can see Graham wants to have a go. Katerina, please.
Hi, just a quick comment on the discussion about decentralization. We have 5 or 6 companies throughout the world which are buying all the Northern Hemisphere arable land, because with climate change, that is going to be the most productive. In the UK, I think are 2 companies that are buying as much land as possible. When we talk about decentralization and, you know, epi-decrease and epi-deindustrialization, I don't think we realize what has been planned. These people are taking control of the means of producing food. And when we talk about how lovely Denmark and Germany are, we have to remember that Denmark is entering NATO and is discussing with Lithuania the possibility of controlling the Balkan Sea, which is, you know, lunatics. And Germany is bankrupt. They have a year worth of industry, because they will have 20% of the gas they need. They are going around cap in hand, trying to find energy from anywhere and can't find it. France is looting Yemen at the moment for oil. So when we talk about, you know, having our little regional grids of you know, solar panels and, you know, lovely windmills, I think we are missing a bigger picture. NATO said, you know, admitted they've been arming and training Ukraine since 2014. The Ukrainians, well, a third of them don't want to be liberated from the Russian. They are desperate not to be liberated from the Russian. But what people in Ukraine wants, that really doesn't matter. The reality is that already a third of the land, which is a huge swathe of arable land in Europe, Ukrainian land, has been sold to 2 American companies. And Poland is buying the rest. It's just a question of, we have, as Marian said, and I agree with her, we have to fight our own demons in this country and get rid of those, and everybody else get rid of theirs, and respect other country way of fighting for sovereignty. But we have to remember where the threats to sovereignty comes from. If we are going to, you know, do anything, Germany is not the example to follow. And having a green party in power, like in Germany, has proven disastrous for their control of the country. So I don't know. This epicommune idea is not feasible, in my opinion. Sorry.
Thank you, Katerina. I mean, the Green Party in Germany certainly is a green capitalist government participant. You know, they have no interest in abolishing capitalism. They have an interest in solar panels and that, but from their perspective, capitalism can continue for as long as it likes. We have two more people with their hands up. If you want to speak or ask a question, please put your hand up now. Anthony, please.
Sorry, I'm moved.
You're unmuted.
Yes, I think it's a turning point what's happening now, because the polarising the working and middle class, and a lot of middle class people looking into the working class, coming part of the working class. I think we've got a big chance of a nationalised energy sector and water. Obviously, we can get on the local level first, but what some of the capitalists could do, get on the local level in order to stop full nationalisation. The right wing of the Labour Party and New Labour are up to that trick under Corbyn. Let's get my thoughts together. I'll come back later.
Okay, that's fine. Come right. Jane, please. Sorry, I think I just clicked. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, right, thanks. I just want to agree with Tony that we've reached the point where we don't really have a choice anymore. We're going to have to enter into a period of civil disobedience if we're going to allow the movement that the unions are leading to be successful and to grow. I think it's quite obvious that the government and that the establishment is expecting civil disobedience. That they've been legislating for it to try and contain it for a couple of years now, and if we're going to link what the unions are leading to the needs and of the very poor, the children with no beds to sleep on, we're all going to have to be ready for civil disobedience. So
that's a really good point, Jane. We should have mentioned it really. This is very true. I mean, capitalism has been in decline for some time, but I think we're nearing a very serious period. And yes, they have made efforts. The working class isn't a threat at the moment, but they certainly have been making plans for that possibility that the working class does get organized again and does become a danger. I mean, our rights have been under attack like not in decades before, and there's hardly any opposition from the official Labour Party opposition. It's pathetic. They're colluding in the various policing bills, etc. So it's certainly a very good point. Thank you for joining us. Anthony, you want to come back in? Come on, let's try.
I'll do that now. I think we mustn't do impression, and some people thought that I think the main radicalisation is going to be in the Labour Party, but some were saying they shouldn't have small formations out, so it would probably be ultra left, but there could be a sizable split as a mass base. But now go from that. Just seeing everything in the Labour Party now to be cynical to think you can solve all the problems of the strikes. In fact, I think the left bureaucrats could kick Castaner out as leader, and Zara Sultana could be leader in the next few weeks and months. And also, it's interesting. I mean, they're trying to deselect her now. That hasn't been talked in the meeting, but also they're trying to deselect Sam Tarry. And the media, I don't think, is too happy about that, because they want their social democracy to contain the upheaval, so they might move on New Labour. But if there is a split by the unions, if they can't get the party back, then there could be a radical left party that could get a mass base and fight for nationalisation and carry that out. But it's a mistake to put the capitalist forces in Ukraine, because you can't separate NATO from the forces that are fighting in Ukraine. Same with Libya. I mean, Ukraine hasn't fully gone capitalist. Russia's still a workers' state. But in Libya, it was a semi-colony. But a lot of the people were more consistent and support the rebels with the imperialists to recolonize it. The difference with Russia, NATO goes in, it's World War III and a nuclear war. Some people have got contradictions, and you plan those contradictions to build a united front. But
1 minute.
One more point. Relates to this. We've got this anti-assertion can take on an anti-war character of stopping the West going further now. And so, because they haven't pulled back and they haven't made concession on that by the worst middle class off, we can build a big anti-war movement, stop intervening against Russia and China. Everything's to play for, and they can be left shifts.
Thanks, comrade. Okay, we've got no more hands up, so I suggest our panel comes back, and if you want to say anything, for example, Alan, I think Katerina made some interesting points in terms of green capitalism. It's still capitalism, Can we, do we have to go a step further than that when what the German government is doing, etc.?
Should I just respond to that now?
Yes, please go on. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think those are fair points, and actually there isn't a perfect country to cite. Every country that you can find really good things happening, you can find really bad things happening. But I think we have to cherry pick. And one of the points about decentralization that I think was made before Katerina was that actually one of the things that is good about the German federal system is that when the strong central government takes a decision, which was that they made a decision that there had to be annual carbon reductions, then that becomes an obligation on the locality. And the arguments that were taking place in the different localities that I went to have a look around, they came up with different priorities that suited where they were. Some in the south were keener on putting solar panels on everything. In the north, they were keener on wind turbines. There was parts of the central belt which were really keen on geothermal. And in a sense, that was fine. But the debate followed an obligation from a strong government lead to the local democracies that had to deliver. And what troubles me about the left's conversations, and in a way has been mirrored in the conversation this evening, is that we try to have them within the parameters that we'd always set for ourselves. And what I'm saying to you is the climate, the planet is going off a cliff. If you look at the roller coaster of this summer, of this year, we have a whole series of ecological crises that require different strategies and intervention measures. And so we've got to become climate anticipators and planners on a different scale. And if I will offer one example from history, I'm really tickled by the fact that Nottingham, forget Robin Hood, Nottingham had someone else that I think we should sing the praises of. It was a guy called Thomas Hawksley, who was born just after the beginning of the 1800s. And in 1830, he became the borough engineer, 1835, I think. And he was looking at water, and he just thought it's not a good idea for people to be drinking the same water that they pee and poo in. So he set about creating a reservoir and a pumping station that he filtered water from the River Trent through gravel and reed beds, and then pumped it to provide pumping stations for the working class in the middle of Nottingham, so that people come and get clean water. And it was seen as a bit of a folly at the time, except that what it meant was that Nottingham was the one place in the whole country that wasn't touched by the cholera epidemic that swept the land and took huge numbers. Hawksley then went on and did the same design works for London, for Glasgow, for Bristol, for Birmingham. But he did that because he looked at something he could see as a problem that needed a different approach and a different solution. And Hawksley was 35 when he did, 25 when he did this. And so my thing to the left is to say, every one of you needs to step back and think at some point you'll be 25. And if you can come up with radical ideas that will provide us for the next generation of solutions for sustainable clean water supply, sustainable sewage disposal, sustainable energy production and food production. Those are going to be the cornerstones upon which we write a different ecological Marxism for the rest of this century. And so my misgivings just about our debate is that as soon as it opened up, there wasn't a single other mention of climate. And that's the thing that, you know, you just can't, the left cannot sit and pretend that there isn't an ecological crisis of enormous proportions that's going to force a rewrite of everything.
Well, I think comrades picked up on they might not use the word climate, but I think the discussion was about, you know, how do you negotiate between a centralized capitalist state where we can't just all build reservoirs, you know, where we were struggling, people struggling to survive. You need to,
you know, let me give you another example.
Power, don't you, as well?
Yeah, let me give you another example. There's a town called Heerlen in the Netherlands that used to be a coal mine in town. And they didn't want to reopen the mine. And they said, well, is there anything we can do with it? Because can we get any sustainable heat out of it? They drilled down, realizing that the galleries, the abandoned galleries, are flooded and full of permanent hot water. So they drilled down, they put a closed loop water pumping system in, and they pump the hot water back up to the surface. They use heat exchangers then to give it an extra boost when it gets to the streets. And they're providing renewable heat, zero carbon heat for the whole town. Now, I went away and I said to the British Geological Society, if we wanted to do that in Britain, where are we over disused coal mines? We have 25,000 disused coal mines around the country. The Geological Society estimates that 1 in 4 of our homes is within ducting distance of that free, perpetual, clean heat. And there are jobs and skills and a sort of circularity of money that will go if we make that sort of visionary shift to living within reducing climate budgets. And that's where it's the left and vision stuff that I think we've got to start to engage with. It's not the politics of yesterday and the battles of yesterday. It's fighting the collapse of capitalism, which for me, the danger is it could retreat into feudalism.
But
and if we want socialism, we've got to move it rapidly in a different direction.
Isn't part of the problem that we're talking about two different things? And I don't see that they're mutually incompatible. We have to both, and I think you're absolutely right. It terrifies me, the climate change issue. And I think we really do have to learn how to foreground it in everything we say. And I think that's what you're saying, is that should be our first stop solution for everything. However, we also have to have an analysis of power and have to actually wrest that power. And to me, that's what you're saying. And I don't see a problem in that. And I absolutely agree with you that now when we're talking about the energy crisis, when we're talking about the cost of living crisis, what we should understand by this is that what we're actually facing is an environmental crisis. Yep. Fundamentally, that's what this energy business is about. It's about an environmental crisis. And this is just the first wave of a tidal mass that's going to start hitting us, which is why so many of these petty solutions that are being proposed, 2p off a bit of tax, all that, it's absolute nonsense. It's drivel, absolute drivel. And what we need to do, and I do agree with you on this, is to foreground those practical solutions, but at the same times acknowledge that what we're doing, to put it in very blunt terms, is also fighting the power, because those petro industries are not going to give it up. The Saudi Arabias, all of those people, they are not, the US are not going to give up their hold on power easily, and that's what we're talking about.
Or the landowners who own the old
Landowners,
mines.
sure, exactly, exactly.
Just let us drill down. Graham,
Well, look, I don't want to get diverted into.
you're very quiet, Graham. Have you got your microphone on properly?
Is this better?
No,
No.
No?
no,
Go closer to your.
Hello? Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
no, not
Can't,
really.
you're very faint.
It was
Okay.
better earlier.
Well, right.
Shout.
Can you hear me now?
Not very well.
But shout.
Let me have one more go because I've got a lot to say. No?
Yes, now
Yeah.
you've plugged it in
Hear
properly.
me now, right? let me leave. I don't want to be diverted into criticising Tony's defence of great Russian chauvinism. I'll leave that for another day, Tony. I want to concentrate on what Alan said because I think he's raised some really important points. It's just the contradiction, or rather the fusion we have to make between the fight for the climate and the fight for socialism. It's not either or. So us class warriors have got to become climate warriors. And the slogan, which is a very good one, is that there's no socialism on a dead planet. But I think also an equally good slogan, which we must fuse into that, is that there's no life planet unless we challenge and destroy the power of capitalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the two have got to go together.
Yeah.
Now, it was interesting because the one time only I sort of winced when Alan spoke was when he said, we've got to go away from the emphasis on the struggle for production into distribution. See, but then, Alan, you said, what we need is a sustainable energy and food production policy. So my view, and it is repeating the fundamentals, as I understand it, of Marxism, is that production is absolutely central to this. But production for what? Production for social need, production for energy and food to feed and sustain the whole of the world's population. That is central. But I don't think we can divorce that from the question of production and of the question of power itself, because it raises also the question of the local, the national, and the international. We need all of these it's like politics. We need all these movements from below, answers from below, because the people in their own experience probably have got a better idea than most of the bureaucrats that try to do it for us. But it still needs linking up. We can have as many of these things as possible, but it still needs linking up into a national governmental solution and ultimately global solution. And that means ultimately the role still, and I'm sorry if it sounds traditional, of the international working class. And that isn't at all in contradiction to what you've said, apart from that one formulation, which I did take issue with about, I mean, we need power globally, locally, nationally, globally, in order that we can produce for need and in order that we can have distribution. But we cannot do any of that unless we succeed in challenging and destroying the power that is going to destroy the power of the capitalist, which, unless destroyed, will itself destroy the world.
Yeah.
That's the point. I mean, Trotsky's old formulation in one of his great documents was learn to think. And that's what you're telling us, Alan. And I take it. We've got to learn to think. But I also think we must try to bring the many, many lessons that many of us have learned over a lifetime into this unprecedented situation that we're in. It is unprecedented. The world, the planet is teetering on the brink.
Yeah.
And there are no answers, not only, of course, from the Labour Party and Starmer, but as you say, really inadequate answers from the left as well. But we've got to get it right. We've got to fuse it. So yes, climate warriors, yes, class warriors. They're not in contradiction. They're actually exactly the same thing.
Absolutely. It's the
Right.
same thing.
Great.
It's the same.
Graham, perhaps I could just rephrase that then to say what we have to do is redefine production, distribution, and exchange in the context of saying, how do all of those elements of in a socialist economy deliver an annual 10% cut in carbon emissions that is the prerequisite for survival? And I think that retains the unity of connectedness with the imperative of surviving to do it.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think we could do better than 10% every year if it was really production for need and production for survival, etc., and not for, you know, what the capitalists want. I think we could do dramatically better.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. That was a thrilling discussion. It was very, very interesting, I thought. It's not time quite to throw out the Marxist baby with the bathwater, but we can add some more things to the bathwater, perhaps. Thank you for joining us. We'll be taking a break next week because some of us who shall remain unnamed, Jackie and Graham, are on holiday again, so we will be missing one show next week. But we're hoping to do more of the clips we've done just the other day with short pieces of commentary, and then welcome everybody again on September the 12th to our next show, which will probably, because we're still planning it, on the war on the left, conducted by not just Keir Starmer, but also Liz Truss, and how we can fight back. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Graham, Jackie. Thank you, comrades, for joining us. Good night.